Welcome students. This is B. GNANA BHARATHI, Assistant Professor from the Department of English, Hindustan, College of Arts and Science, Chennai. Today we will be looking at the concept of Tinai from the theory of eco-criticism and how this concept could be developed into an effective indigenous theory in understanding literary text from a cultural perspective. So we will be looking at Tinai from a more broad based angle and how this concept of Tinai, which is an ancient concept used by the Tamil societies and communities, can be an effective tool in understanding literary and cultural text in relevance to today's contemporary environmental crisis and knowledge forms. So today we will look at the concept of Tinai, which is an ancient indigenous concept used from the period of Sangam age, and how this concept of Tinai can be an effective tool in analyzing literature and cultural text. So moving in further, we look at the basic definition of what Tinai can be as proposed by the ancient Tamil scholar Tolkapiyar. The concept of Tinai is an order of community life found among early Tamils and perhaps others. Its characteristic feature is its emphasis on land and life relationship. Accordingly, human communities, like any other organisms, were organized on an eco-regional basis. So the primary idea of Tinai is to understand how humans dwelled in tune with their natural surrounding or environment, the relationship between people and their land, and with the human and that of the non-human world. How the human world interacted with the non-human world and how effectively the non-human world also responded basically to the human needs. So this what is trying to be the proposement of the concept of Tinai in understanding eco-criticism from an indigenous point of view. Connection between Tinai ecosystem and ecology. P.L. Swami, who is an ancient scholar, well-known scholar and an art critic, tells that the modern concept of ecosystem and ecology are surprisingly close to the concept of Tinai division. In ancient Sangam literature, the term ecology, which is a scientific term, means that the relationship of plants, animals and people to that of their environment from time to time through change of seasons, rainfall, climate and the influence of man himself. So basically what we try to understand from an ecological point of view is to understand how the human community is tuned with that of their surrounding natural environment. This is what is proposed in Tinai also. How well the cultural activities of human beings and that of their knowledge practices, which we call the indigenous knowledge or the local knowledge, is in tune to that of their local or the natural surrounding environment. So this is what P.L. Swami tries to use or apply the concept of Tinai as a relevant and a very pertinent or a significant eco-critical concept in today's era. However, the systematic ecological approach begins only later in the 80s. Only from 1980s, the concept gained much significance. The idea of eco-criticism or the discipline or the scholarship of eco-criticism began in America from the period of 1960. But Tinai started gaining popularity only from the age of 1980s, when many Tamil scholars started implementing its ideas, applications or framework into English literature today, which is kind of extending into a more sophisticated domain as cultural studies. So however, the systematic ecological approach begins only in the later 80s, when the ecological concept like biome, these are ecological concepts. By biome we mean that the simple relationship between human beings and that of their natural surrounding environment was adopted, which is Tinai, was adopted to elucidate the theory of eco-critical practices. So from 1960s, the eco-criticism began from the Western countries, predominantly from USA or America. Then later in 1980s and 1990s, the concept of Tinai, which is an indigenous concept and an Indian concept, started gaining prominence. Here we see a map of Tamil Nadu, and there are different shades of regions of Tinai. The total kind of landscapes of Tinai are 5 different categories, namely the Kurunji Tinai, the Palai Tinai, the Mullai Tinai and the Marudam Tinai and the Neidal Tinai. So there are totally 5 different kinds of landscapes proposed by Tolkapiyar in the notion of Tinai. I repeat, it is the Kurunji, 2 the Palai, 3 the Mullai, 4th the Marudam, and 5th and the last is the Neidal Tinai. The social life in ancient Tamilagam. The social life of the ancient Tamil was in association with that of the division of the land. According to each one's land and landscape, human communities constructed their culture and knowledge system, which we called as Tinai. The division of each land, which I was telling in the previous minutes, which is called the Kurunji Tinai or Neidal Tinai or Palai Tinai, the division of such lands, the different lands, the totally 5 different lands was called as Tinai. Tinai means Nilam or the land or the relationship of the human communities with that of their natural environment. Each Tinai is associated with a particular landscape. For example, there is a Tinai called as Neidal Tinai, which means the literal, basically meaning the seashore areas, the coastal areas. So in India, there are 2 predominant coasts. One is the Malabar coast and the Coromandel coast. The Coromandel coast covers the Bay of Bengal that runs from Tamil Nadu up till Calcutta, and to the left we have the Malabar and the Konkan coast, which stretches from Kerala up till Gujarat. So these kind of 2 coastal areas or zones are called as Neidal Tinai, and the people who live there are called as fishermen. So the Tinai of these fishermen is basically understanding the cultural practices and the knowledges and the lifestyle that has been associated with that of this Neidal landscape in long term. So such Neidal landscape, which is the seashore, is called as the Neidal Tinai. There are 5 Tinais, as I was telling, totally 5 Tinais. They are Kurunji, Mullai, Palai, Marudam and Neidal. We will see what are these kind of Tinais each one are. First one is the Kurunji Tinai, which is the mountainous areas. It consists of forest and mountains, whichever is a thick forest and dense forest, like how we have Ooty, Kodaikanal or the regions of Western Ghats. These categories or zones fall under the Kurunji landscape. 2, the Mullai landscape, which is the forest and its surroundings. This forms the second sort of a landscape. 3, the Marudam landscape, which is basically the agricultural land and its adjoining areas. For example, the delta regions of Tamil Nadu region present in Tanjavur and other zones of Kaveri belt form under this category, which is called the Marudam. 4th is the Neidal Tinai, which I was telling previously is the seashore and its surrounding environment, the coastal areas. Last one is the Palai. Palai means basically the desert regions, which is a kind of, it needn't be a complete desert region, but also a semi-desert area. If suppose a region or a zone doesn't get enough rainfall for a particular period of time, then that can also be considered as a Palai. Palai is quite a tricky zone. It can either be completely a desert zone or it could be a semi-desert zone. If there is a drought, then becomes a Palai. If it's completely desert with desert sand dunes and other things, then also it is considered Palai. So there are totally 5 landscapes: Kurunji, Mullai, Marudam, Neidal and Palai. And at last, which I was telling, Palai means it is either completely arid or semi-arid. So this you need to keep in point. Moving on. So here you can see a picture of a landscape. It is a very mountainous region where you can view waterfalls, the forest regions and the hilly sides. So when all these 3 entities are connected to each other, it becomes a Kurunji landscape. So places like Ooty, Uttakamun, Kodaikanal, Munnar or any other sort of zones which are covering in the Western Ghats fall highly under the Kurunji landscape. Moving on. Here in the slide you will see few faunas, which are the basic animals and birds that are found in these landscapes. The first one is the elephant, second one is the tiger, fourth one is the bison, and the last one is the monkey, the langur category. So these are the predominant entities, the non-human, the fauna entities found in this landscape, Kurunji landscape. Then we see a lady holding a tuber or a yam. So this we have got to analysis, which we focus on a particular area or a zone. When we focus on a particular area, zone or a Tinai, we got to understand what sort of a people are living there, whether they are kind of forest dwellers or they are fishermen. So accordingly, we have to understand what would be their cultural practices. So in this slide, you will see 2 pictures. It is based on the Kurunji landscape, which is the hilly area or the hilly zone. We find one lady holding a yam or a tuber, which we called as the Maravalli Kalangu or the Bhumi Sakaravalli Kalangu, which is uprooted from the ground, underneath the ground, which becomes a part of their staple diet. This is part of their local food culture. The next picture is the collection of honey. Honey forms an important staple diet in the zones of Kurunji. Honey adds warmth to the body and it is also plays a significant role in all key rituals and religious practices practiced by the Kurunji zone people. So yam, or tuber, and honey form the staple diet of the Kurunji landscape. So in that kind of a format, we got to analyze what are the important faunas, floras, foodscapes, and kind of different communities that inhabit the particular zone. We will move on further. The key elements to identify. In this slide, you will see what are the key elements that we got to identify from each sort of Tinai. As I told, there are 5 Tinais, and when we are given a literary or a cultural text, our predominant approach should be in identifying the key elements of that particular zone, region, or the Tinai. So point number 1 is flora, which are the plant and tree species found in that particular area. Point number 2 is the fauna, which are the birds and the animal categories found in that particular zone or region or Tinai. Third one is the people, whether they are tribe. If it's a hilly area, then it becomes a tribe. If it's a Neidal Tinai, it becomes a fisherman community. If it becomes a Marudam landscape, it becomes the peasants or the farmers, the delta regions or the Kaveri delta regions, which I was talking about. The last is Palai. Palai are the desert dwellers. They are called as the desert dwellers who inhabited the large scale zones or the regions of Palai landscape. So 3, it should be the people who has to be identified from that particular zone. Then the occupation. What sort of an occupation they are predominantly following? For example, if it's a hilly zone, which is the Kurunji Tinai, the predominant activity would be hunting and gathering. That is the activity that they do. Tribes till to date, they involve themselves in the practice of hunting and gathering. So we need to identify what is the primary or the chief occupation of that particular zone or category. Then we can look at food. What are the native or the indigenous or the local food that is identified from that particular zone? Moving on, we got to analyze what are the material cultures. What are the different sort of materials that is available from that particular zone. For example, in used for house construction, in constructing of houses, in practicing or doing their agricultural practices, or hunting, or even cooking utensils. We called as Pulangu Porutkal, which is called as the material culture. We got to understand and categorize what are the local kind of materials available from each sort of Tinai and how effectively these people use them indigenously. By indigenous, I mean in local ways, in order to help to spread their knowledge forms. Moving on, the music can be analyzed. Fourth, the religion practiced. Each zone or each Tinai will have a different religious practices to each one of them. So you got to analyze what would be the religious practices. Then the water sources. For example, the Marudam zone will have a different kind of a water source. There will be a river, but whereas a Kurunji Tinai may have a small stream or a waterfall, whereas it will be completely different in a Neidal zone, which is a coastal category. So you got to identify all these sort of entities and how these entities, which I have listed, the flora, the fauna, the people, their occupation, food cultures, material cultures, music, religion, and water sources. So all these things are predominantly the non-human forms or entities. So how the non-human world or the forms are successfully interacting with that of the human forms and culture, and how effectively the community or the people belonging to each of these Tinais have in long term interacted successfully with their Tinai zones in order to gain a local ecological wisdom. So that is the predominant idea of Tinai. So you use Tinai framework in order to understand a cultural system and how effectively that cultural system has interacted well with their surrounding natural environment in long terms in order to gain a very ethical and a sustainable knowledge form. Tinai basically is an indigenous notion of ecology. As I was telling you previously in a couple of minutes before, there are lots sort of eco-critical versions. Ecocriticism has emerged from USA, America in 1960s. Then it branched out into various forms or versions. So there is a Western notion of eco-criticism and also an Asian form of eco-criticism. So there is an American eco-criticism, there is Canadian eco-criticism, so then there is Indian eco-criticism, which we call the Tinai eco-criticism. Then Indonesian people follow one particular form of eco-criticism. Then the Australian Aboriginal hunters or the inhabitants, the native inhabitants of Australia, follow their own forms of eco-criticism. So eco-criticism is not just one form, it is multiple versions, and it is highly eco-critical in its different ways according to the local climate, texture, and landscape. So it is not purely a Western notion, it has branched out today into both Western as well as Asian forms. So there are American eco-criticism, Indian eco-criticism, Australian eco-criticism, Canadian eco-criticism, and New Zealandian eco-criticism. So you got to know eco-criticism is not a very conventional or a fixed format. It can be flexible or dynamic according to each sort of a landscape accordingly. Moving on, it is a significant bioregional practice that seeks to address current day environmental crisis. So if you want to understand the particular environmental crisis that we are facing today in the world or in the country at present, the concept of Tinai could be an effective tool in analyzing how it was before and how it has changed now. How the floral, faunal and other community and the cultural activities of the people was in tune with that of their natural environment, and how all those entities with that of the human forms and the non-human environment has significantly changed today. So in order to understand the environmental damage or the ecological crisis and other forms of stress factors, the concept of Tinai, the ancient concept of Tinai, could be an effective tool in analyzing literary and cultural texts that kind of reflect all these environmental crises or climate change forms. So these are few musical instruments which you will see when the slide is put up for you in the presentation. So these are some musical instruments which the particular people of that particular landscape tend to use. These all form under the category of their material culture, predominant material culture. Moving on, these are some tribal communities and this is their dance form. So we got to understand what sort of religious and the entertainment factors are being developed by that particular people belonging to that particular Tinai, and why do they do such forms and practices in order to be in tune with that of their surrounding natural environment. Whatever they do as part of their culture is in effective tune with that of their natural environment. So you got to understand their material culture, art forms and entertainment categories in terms of relation to Tinai, and how all these art forms and cultural practices have been in tune with that of their natural surrounding environment. That is one predominant idea which Tinai seeks to explain. The last one, what is the Tinai epistemology? By the term epistemology, we mean the knowledge forms. What are the knowledge forms, or what Tinai is trying to do basically, or teaches basically? Western science is based on experiment. We always understand that Western science is purely based on experiment, but Tinai is based upon the close observation of nature. So it is in everyday practice. The Tinai people or the Tinai landscape people are in tune with that of their natural environment from minute to minute to second to second. So Tinai is something is closely based upon the observations of nature. Whatever changes in the nature will be inculcated or implemented into their cultural practices immediately. Number two, native science, which is Tinai, which is our local science, is of order over chaos. Tinai, or the concept of Tinai, forms a cultural practice, and it forms a sort of a very ethical practices that needs to be followed in tune with that of environment. So here nature is considered to be very chaotic, whereas Tinai practices or the cultural practices of the people belonging to that particular Tinai tune the environment. So it is culture over nature. So the culture is in a very flexible or a dynamic form, is operating in a very dynamic form and in a very ethical and a sustainable form, so that it doesn't allow nature to be depleted or kind of demolished. They do it very smoothly and sustainably. They take whatever is only necessary for them from nature. They do not over exploit resources. So moving on, the scientific language is binary. We always see the scientific language to be very binary, but a native language or a local language is a process. It is in continuous process. So whatever happens in the surrounding environment immediately happens or becomes a part of the language. So what happens when you forget your language? You tend to forget your landscape. So the more and more you move away from your mother tongue or your native language, the more and more you are moving away from your native landscape, which is very dangerous. The scientific, their science is actually their culture. So the Tinai people, the each categories of Tinai zones and their people, whatever cultural practices that they do or practice is actually their science. So the science is not different from culture. Their culture is actually science. So a Tinai science. So what is the ultimate motive of this Tinai is it seeks for a multi-species relevance. How human world can coexist with that of the natural world, how the human and the non-human world can mutually benefit from each other and without any over exploitation can become a future resource for the forthcoming generations. So how well we have to live without that of our land and the landscape, and how well we have to use effectively our natural resources, and how multi-species, various species which I was talking, the flora, fauna, the water resources, the material culture, how all these multi-species can be effectively brought into the cultural practices of human beings and can be ethically used in understanding nature and its other forms. Last one, the significances of circular perspectives. From this point of view or from this slide, you will understand that nature, Mother Nature is always cyclic in nature. It has to constantly undergo a change. So if when you stop this cycle, it means you are creating a problem to the natural rhythm or the flow of the nature. So it has to be always in cycle or in tune to the local environment. So whenever you analyze a literary text or a cultural text from a Tinai point of view, keep in mind whether the flora, fauna, material culture, the occupation of the people, the religious forms and other sort of practices are very cyclic in form. If they are cyclic, that means the Tinai practice is in tune with that of the natural environment. If it doesn't go in a cyclic form, then it goes in a very linear or a straight form. It means that it is opposite, it's operating in a very opposite manner or in a binary manner to that of their natural environment. So cyclic perspective is the ultimate motive of Tinai. So if it is in cycle, it is in good relationship, it's an organic relationship. If it's not or if it's otherwise, then it is an inorganic relationship. So that's what you need to keep in mind. So in our next class, with more examples, we will see how we can use the components or the categories of each Tinai zones in understanding literary text and cultural text. Tinai can be an effective tool in analyzing almost any sort of text. It could be a novel, a short story, a poem, a drama or whatever it may be. Tinai is kind of a green reading. It is a very, very indigenous, native, local reading. So Tinai has to be pioneered at the very much of a significant cost, and it is time that we implement Tinai in order to understand the ecological crisis of our global health today. So with that, we will see in our next class how with more examples we can kind of analyze Tinai and from its eco-critical point of view with more on literary and cultural text. Thank you.